The doors of the chapel stood open, and every eye turned toward them, waiting for a groom who was never going to walk through. Clara Whitfield stood at the altar with her hands folded around a bouquet of white roses, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the guests behind her could hear it. The organ music had stopped 3 minutes ago. The priest kept glancing at his pocket watch. Somewhere in the third row, her mother's smile had begun to crack at the edges. Clara told herself it was nothing. Grooms were late sometimes. Traffic, nerves, a missing cufflink. Anything could delay a man on his wedding day. She squeezed the stems of the roses until a thorn pressed into her palm, and she welcomed the small sting because it gave her something to focus on besides the silence stretching through the chapel like a held breath. Then the side door opened, and it was not Nathaniel who walked in. It was his best man, a thin, nervous young man named Peter, his face pale as chalk, his tie already loosened as if he could not stand the feeling of it around his neck a moment longer. He walked halfway down the aisle and stopped, looking at Clara with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, an expression of pity mixed with dread. "Clara," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "I need to speak with you." She should have asked him to wait, should have insisted the conversation happen privately, away from 200 pairs of watching eyes, but her body would not move. Her feet felt nailed to the floor of the altar, and all she could do was stare at Peter, and wait for the words that were about to end everything she had built her future around. "Nathaniel isn't coming," Peter said. "He's gone. He left this morning, with Isabel." The name hit her like a slap. Isabel Hartley had been her maid of honor, her closest friend since university, the woman standing 3 feet behind her at this very moment, wearing a pale blue dress, holding a smaller bouquet, smiling the practiced smile of someone who had spent months pretending nothing was wrong. Clara turned her head, slowly, and found the space behind her empty. Isabel was gone. She must have slipped out during the silence, while everyone's attention was fixed on the doors, while Clara herself was still hoping. A murmur spread through the chapel like water finding cracks in stone. Whispers passed from pew to pew, faster than Clara could process them. She heard fragments, ran off together. Poor girl, did she know? The whispers grew louder, feeding on each other, and Clara felt herself becoming smaller with every syllable, as though the whole room was shrinking around her, pressing in, leaving no space to breathe. She looked down at the roses in her hands. She looked at her wedding dress, chosen after 4 fittings, the lace sleeves she had fallen in love with the moment she tried them on. She looked at the aisle stretching out in front of her, empty, and she understood with a clarity that felt like falling, that there would be no wedding today. There might never be a wedding at all, not to the man she had planned her whole life around. Her mother rose from the front pew, one hand pressed to her chest, but even she seemed frozen, unsure whether to rush forward or wait for some signal that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. No signal came. Peter stood in the aisle, wringing his hands, offering nothing more than the truth he had already delivered. Clara felt the tears rising and fought them back with everything she had. She would not cry here. She would not give the whispering crowd the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in front of them, not after they had already watched her be humiliated in the cruelest way a woman could be humiliated, on the one day meant to be entirely her own. It was then that she noticed the man standing at the back of the chapel. He had been seated in the last row, near the doors, a place reserved for guests who were not close family or close friends, the kind of seat given to someone who was invited out of politeness rather than affection. Clara barely knew him. His name was Julian Ashford, and he held the title of Duke of Rothmere, a distant connection through her father's side of the family, a man she had met perhaps twice before, both times at gatherings too large and too loud for real conversation. He was tall, with dark hair swept back neatly, and eyes the color of storm clouds, calm on the surface but holding something deeper beneath. He was not whispering like the others. He was not looking away in embarrassment or leaning toward his neighbor to trade gossip. He was watching Clara directly, his expression unreadable, and as she met his gaze across the length of the chapel, something in his posture changed. He stood. The chapel quieted, curious now about this new development, wondering what a man they barely recognized intended to do. Julian walked forward, unhurried, his footsteps the only sound besides the priest's uneasy breathing. Clara watched him approach with something between confusion and disbelief, unsure what possible reason a near stranger could have for walking toward her at a moment like this. He stopped at the base of the altar steps and looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Clara searched his face for pity, the same pity she had seen in Peter's eyes, but she did not find it. What she found instead was something steadier, something that looked almost like resolve. "Miss Whitfield," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel, "I know this is not my place, But I cannot sit and watch you stand here alone while people speak about you as though you cannot hear them. Clara's throat tightened. What are you doing? I am asking you not to let this be the end of your day, he said. You do not deserve to walk out of this chapel as the woman who was left at the altar. You deserve better than the story they are already writing about you in their heads. The whispers around them had stopped entirely now, replaced by a silence so complete that Clara could hear her own pulse in her ears. She glanced at her mother, who had gone very still, her hand still pressed over her heart, watching this unfamiliar man with wide, uncertain eyes. I don't understand, Clara said quietly. What is it you're suggesting? Julian held her gaze without flinching. I am suggesting that you do not have to leave this chapel unmarried, unless that is truly what you want. I am offering to be your groom, here, today, if you will have me. A gasp rippled through the guests, sharp and immediate, followed by a wave of murmuring louder than anything before it. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Surely she had misheard him. Surely no one, not even a duke known for his boldness, would say such a thing in front of 200 witnesses, in a chapel still smelling of the flowers meant for another man's wedding.
You cannot be serious,
Clara whispered, more to herself than to him. I have never been more serious in my life, Julian answered. I understand this is unconventional. I understand you owe me no explanation and I ask for none. But I will not stand by and let you be humiliated a moment longer than necessary. The choice is entirely yours. Clara looked past him, at the sea of faces waiting for her answer, at her mother frozen between the pews, at the empty aisle where Nathaniel should have been standing. She thought of the months of planning, the years of loving a man who had chosen to disappear rather than face her honestly. She thought of Isabel's practiced smile and the friendship that had apparently meant nothing at all. And then she looked at Julian Ashford, a man she barely knew, offering her a way out of the worst moment of her life, with nothing to gain for himself except scandal and speculation. Why would you do this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't even know me. Because no one else in this room is doing anything, Julian said simply. And because I think you deserve to leave this chapel with your head held high, whatever you decide to do next. Clara's hands trembled around the roses. The priest, sensing the shift in the room, took a hesitant step closer, unsure whether to intervene or wait. Her mother rose fully now, moving toward the altar with uncertain steps, torn between shock and something that looked almost like hope. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady the storm inside her chest. When she opened them again, Julian was still there, still watching her with that same calm patience, waiting for an answer he seemed prepared to accept no matter what it was. The chapel held its breath around them, 200 guests suspended in silence, waiting to see whether Clara Whitfield would walk away from this altar broken, or whether she would take the strangest, boldest chance of her life and let a stranger become her husband before the sun set on the worst day she had ever known. Her mind raced through everything that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the small apartment she and Nathaniel had chosen together, the boxes already packed for their move after the honeymoon, the life she had imagined so clearly that she could almost touch it. All of it had dissolved in the space of a single sentence from a nervous best man standing in the aisle. She thought too of what would happen if she simply walked away. She pictured herself changing out of the wedding dress in some back room of the chapel, slipping out a side entrance to avoid the crowd, driving home in silence while her mother tried to find words of comfort that would not come. She pictured the weeks that would follow, the sympathetic phone calls, the careful way people would look at her in shops and at church, as though grief were something visible on her skin. None of it was fair. None of it was something she had done to deserve. And yet she understood, standing there with roses crushed in her grip, that fairness had very little to do with what happened next. Only her choice mattered now. Julian remained still at the base of the steps, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, patient in a way that felt almost unnatural given the weight of what he had just proposed. He did not press her. He did not fill the silence with more persuasion. He simply waited, as though he understood that a decision made under pressure would mean nothing at all, and that whatever answer she gave had to come from her alone. Clara's mother reached the edge of the altar steps and looked between her daughter and the stranger offering to become her son-in-law within the hour. Clara, she said softly, you do not have to do anything you are not certain of. I know, Clara whispered back, though her voice did not sound entirely her own. She was aware of every eye in the chapel fixed upon her, aware of the photographer near the side aisle who had not lowered his camera, aware of Isabel's abandoned bouquet lying forgotten on a pew where she had left it before slipping away. She looked once more at the empty space where Nathaniel should have stood, feeling something inside her harden, quiet, and certain. Whatever love she had carried for him had been built on a lie for longer than she wanted to imagine. He had chosen his path weeks or months ago, in secret, and left her to discover the truth in the cruelest possible way, in front of everyone she knew. Julian had chosen too, but in the opposite direction. He had stood up when no one else moved. He had walked toward her instead of watching from a safe distance. Whatever his reasons, whatever strange courage or recklessness had driven him to speak, he had not looked away from her shame the way the rest of the room had. "If I say yes," Clara said carefully, testing the words as though they might shatter in her mouth, "you understand this changes nothing about who we are to each other. We are strangers." "We are," Julian agreed, "but strangers can choose to become something else, in time, if both are willing. I ask only for the chance to spare you from walking out of here unmarried and humiliated, nothing more." Clara felt the tears she had been fighting finally rise to the surface, not from sorrow this time, but from something closer to disbelief at the strange mercy being offered to her. She glanced once more at her mother, who gave the smallest, most uncertain nod, as though to say the choice, whatever it was, belonged entirely to her daughter. The priest cleared his throat gently from beside the altar, his pocket watch now forgotten in his hand, waiting like everyone else for the answer that would decide how this extraordinary day would end. Clara's answer came out as barely more than a breath. Yes. The single word seemed to travel through the chapel faster than sound should have allowed. Julian's shoulders eased slightly, the only sign that her answer had mattered to him at all. The priest, sensing the moment had arrived, straightened his robes and stepped forward with a mixture of caution and relief, clearly uncertain whether he had ever presided over a wedding quite like this one. "Are you certain?" her mother asked one final time, her hand resting gently on Clara's arm. "I am certain of one thing," Clara answered, her voice steadier now. "I will not leave this chapel as the woman everyone pities. Whatever happens after today, I choose this." Julian climbed the remaining steps and stood beside her at the altar, close enough that Clara could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the kind of detail she would never have noticed from a distance. Up close, he did not look triumphant or pleased with himself. He looked focused, almost solemn, as though he understood the seriousness of what they were about to do and had no intention of treating it lightly. The priest asked if there was a marriage license already prepared, and for a moment, it seemed the entire plan might collapse before it truly began. But Julian, calm as ever, produced identification and confirmed that as a peer of the realm he could arrange the necessary documents through a special license already held in reserve for family emergencies, a privilege of his title that Clara had not known existed until that very moment. Whispers rippled through the chapel again, this time carrying a note of astonishment rather than pity. The ceremony that followed felt like something out of a dream Clara had not chosen to have. The vows were simple, exchanged in front of guests who had arrived expecting one wedding and were now witnessing an entirely different one. Clara's voice trembled as she repeated the words, not from fear exactly, but from the strange vertigo of watching her own life turn in a direction she never could have predicted an hour earlier. When Julian slipped a ring onto her finger, borrowed hastily from his own family's collection kept for precisely such emergencies, Clara felt the cool metal settle against her skin and wondered whether she was making the gravest mistake of her life, or the only decision that made any sense at all. Outside the chapel, after the brief ceremony concluded, the guests spilled onto the steps in clusters, talking in low, excited voices about what they had just witnessed. Clara stood beside her new husband, still wearing the wedding dress meant for another man, holding roses that had begun to wilt in her tight grip. Photographers who had come to document her wedding to Nathaniel now aimed their cameras at her and Julian instead, capturing images that would likely appear in every gossip column by morning. "You do not have to speak to any of them," Julian said quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear. "If you would rather leave now, my car is waiting." Clara nodded, grateful for an excuse to escape the crowd of curious faces, before her composure gave out entirely. Julian guided her through the throng with a steady hand at her back, not possessive, simply present, the way a man might guide someone he intended to protect, rather than someone he intended to claim. They reached a dark car waiting at the curb, and Clara slid into the back seat, finally releasing the breath she felt she had been holding since Peter first walked down the aisle. The drive to Rothmere Estate took nearly an hour, winding through countryside Clara had only glimpsed before from train windows. Julian sat across from her, giving her the space to stare silently out the window, watching fields and hedgerows blur past in the fading afternoon light. Neither of them spoke for a long while, the silence not entirely uncomfortable, both of them absorbing the weight of what had just happened. "I imagine you have questions," Julian finally said. Clara turned from the window. "More than I know how to ask." "Then ask what matters most first," he said. "The rest can wait." She considered this. turning the enormity of her situation over in her mind. Why did you really do this? And do not tell me it was simply kindness. No one offers marriage to a stranger out of kindness alone. Julian was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. My family expects me to marry soon. My mother has grown insistent, and there have been several arrangements suggested to me that I have refused, each less appealing than the last. When I saw you standing at that altar, abandoned in front of everyone who mattered to you, I recognized something. Not pity, though I understand why it might have looked that way. I recognized a woman who deserved better than what she was being given, by her groom and by the world watching her suffer for his mistake. That still does not explain why you offered marriage instead of simply comforting a stranger, Clara pressed. Because comfort would have faded by tomorrow, and you would still have been the woman left at the altar, Julian said. This solves two problems at once. You are spared further humiliation, and I satisfy my family's expectations without entering a marriage, arranged entirely for advantage on someone else's terms. It is practical, Miss Whitfield, nothing more complicated than that. Mrs. Ashford, Clara corrected softly, testing the name for the first time, feeling its unfamiliar weight settle over her like a coat 2 sizes too large. Something flickered across Julian's expression, gone as quickly as it appeared. Mrs. Ashford, he repeated, as though confirming the truth of it to himself. The car eventually turned down a long gravel drive lined with ancient oak trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the last of the daylight into soft, shifting patterns. At the end of the drive stood Rothmere Estate, a house so large and so old that Clara felt her breath catch despite everything else occupying her thoughts. Stone walls rose 3 stories high, ivy climbing along one wing, windows glowing faintly with lamplight from within. This is where you live? Clara asked, unable to keep the astonishment from her voice. This is where we live now, Julian corrected gently, for as long as our arrangement continues. The car came to a stop before wide stone steps, and a household staff member emerged from the front doors before Julian had even opened his own. An older woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun approached with quick, purposeful steps, her expression shifting from professional composure to open surprise as she took in Clara's wedding dress. Your Grace, the woman said, addressing Julian with practiced formality before her eyes moved to Clara. We were not informed of any change in plans. Neither was I. Until this afternoon, Mrs. Colton, Julian replied, a faint, wry note entering his voice for the first time since Clara had met him. This is my wife, Clara. Please see that a room is prepared for her, and inform the rest of the staff there will be introductions in the morning. Mrs. Colton's eyebrows rose fractionally, though decades of service had clearly trained her not to ask questions aloud. Of course, Your Grace. Welcome, Mrs. Ashford. Clara offered a small, uncertain smile, still adjusting to the sound of her new name spoken by a stranger, in a house she had never before set foot inside. She followed Julian and Mrs. Colton through the grand entrance hall, past portraits of solemn ancestors watching from gilded frames, past a curved staircase that seemed to belong more to a museum than a home. I know this is overwhelming, Julian said quietly as they walked. You need not decide anything else tonight. Rest. Eat, if you are able. Tomorrow we can discuss what comes next, and what this arrangement will mean going forward. Clara nodded, grateful for the small mercy of postponement, though her mind continued to churn with questions she had not yet found the courage to ask. What would it mean to live as this man's wife in name only? How long was this arrangement meant to last? And what, if anything, awaited her back in the life she had left behind that morning? The life that had ended the moment Peter walked down the aisle with news that shattered everything she believed about her future. Mrs. Colton led her up the staircase to a bedroom far grander than anything Clara had ever slept in, with tall windows overlooking dark gardens and a fire already crackling in the hearth. Left alone at last, Clara sat on the edge of the enormous bed, still wearing her wedding dress, and allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not from sorrow alone, though sorrow was certainly part of it. She cried from exhaustion, from shock, from the impossible speed at which her entire life had turned inside out within the space of a single afternoon. She had woken that morning as a bride preparing to marry the man she loved. She was going to sleep that night as a stranger's wife, in a house she did not know, wearing a ring that did not yet feel like her own, carrying a new name she had not chosen for herself. Somewhere beyond her window, an owl called out into the darkening sky, and Clara wondered, not for the first time that day, whether she had just made the bravest decision of her life or the most reckless one, and whether there was truly any difference between the two. A soft knock came at the door some time later, and Clara wiped her eyes hastily before answering. A young maid stood in the hallway, carrying a tray with tea and a small plate of bread and cheese. along with a folded nightgown draped over her arm. "Mrs. Colton thought you might need something simple to change into," the maid said, her voice gentle, her eyes kind, despite the obvious curiosity she was too well trained to voice aloud. "My name is Charlotte. I will be attending to you, if that suits." "Thank you, Charlotte," Clara said, accepting the tray with hands that still trembled slightly. "I appreciate the kindness." Charlotte lingered a moment longer than necessary, glancing at the wedding dress still clinging to Clara's frame. "It is not my place to say anything, Mrs. Ashford, but the whole staff has heard what happened today. Whatever brought you here, I think it was a brave thing you did, standing tall instead of running." Clara offered a tired smile, touched by the unexpected warmth from a stranger. "I am not certain bravery had much to do with it. I think I simply ran out of other options." "Sometimes that is where bravery begins," Charlotte said, before excusing herself with a small curtsy and closing the door softly behind her. Alone again, Clara finally allowed herself to remove the wedding dress, folding it carefully despite everything it now represented, and changed into the borrowed nightgown. She sat by the fire, sipping tea that had gone lukewarm, and let her thoughts drift back over the events of the day, searching for some sense of order in the chaos. She thought of her mother, who had stayed behind at the chapel to manage the aftermath of the abandoned reception, promising to visit Rothmere within the week once Clara had settled. She thought of her father, long past, and wondered what he would have made of his daughter marrying a duke she had known for less than an hour. He had always told her that courage mattered more than comfort, and she clung to that thought now as something steady to hold on to. She thought too of Nathaniel, and found that her anger toward him had cooled into something closer to disbelief. How long had he been planning his escape? Had he ever truly loved her, or had she simply been convenient until something better appeared in the form of her own closest friend? She did not yet have the strength to examine those questions too closely, so she set them aside, promising herself she would face them another day, when the shock of everything else had faded enough to make room for smaller griefs. A light rain began to tap against the windows as the evening deepened, and Clara found the sound oddly soothing, a reminder that the world continued turning regardless of how dramatically her own life had shifted. She thought about Julian, this stranger who was now legally her husband, and tried to piece together what she actually knew of him beyond his title and the calm authority with which he had spoken to her at the altar. She recalled fragments from prior gatherings, second-hand stories exchanged among distant relatives. There had been talk, years ago, of an engagement that ended badly, though no one ever offered details, only knowing glances and quickly changed subjects whenever his name arose. She wondered if that history explained the guardedness she had sensed beneath his calm exterior, the sense that he was a man accustomed to keeping his true feelings locked away from view. A second knock interrupted her thoughts, softer than Charlotte's had been. Clara opened the door to find Julian himself standing in the hallway, having changed out of his formal wedding attire into a simple dark jacket, looking somehow both more relaxed and more serious than he had at the chapel. "I did not mean to disturb you," he said. "I only wanted to see that you had settled in comfortably before the night grew too late." "I am managing," Clara said, though the words felt thinner than she intended. "It has been a great deal to absorb in one day." "It has," Julian agreed. "I do not expect you to feel at ease here yet, or perhaps for some time. I only ask that you allow yourself the patience to adjust, without pressure to feel anything you do not yet feel." Clara studied him for a moment, searching his face for some hint of what truly lay beneath his composed exterior. "Can I ask you something honestly, without fear that it will offend you?" "Always," he said. "Do you regret what you did today? Now that the moment has passed and the audience has gone home, does it feel like a mistake?" Julian considered the question seriously, taking his time before answering, which Clara found she appreciated more than a quick reassurance would have offered. "No," he said finally. "I do not regret it. I regret that you were placed in a position where such an offer became necessary in the first place, but the offer itself, and your acceptance of it, I do not regret." Something in his steady certainty eased a small portion of the tension coiled in Clara's chest. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For today, whatever comes of this arrangement, I will not forget what you did." Julian gave a small nod, something almost like the beginning of a genuine smile touching the corner of his mouth before it retreated behind his usual composure. "Rest well, Clara. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight, at least, you may simply breathe." He left her then, closing the door with quiet care, and Clara returned to her seat by the fire, watching the flames dance while the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows. For the first time since the chapel doors had failed to open for her intended groom, she felt something unfamiliar settle over her. Not quite peace, but perhaps the beginning of it. a fragile sense that despite everything lost that day, something new and uncertain had also been given to her in its place. She did not know yet what kind of marriage this would become, or what kind of man truly lived behind Julian Ashford's careful composure. But as she finally climbed into the unfamiliar bed and closed her eyes, Clara allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that tomorrow might bring answers gentler than the ones the day had already delivered. Morning arrived at Rothmere Estate with pale gray light filtering through heavy curtains, and Clara woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was, until the unfamiliar grandeur of the room reminded her of everything that had happened the day before. She lay still for a long moment, staring at the ornate ceiling, letting the weight of her new reality settle over her fully now that sleep no longer softened its edges. She was married. To a duke. A man she had known for barely 24 hours. Charlotte arrived shortly after with a fresh set of clothes, borrowed from a cousin of Julian's who was said to be near Clara's size until proper garments could be arranged in town. Clara dressed slowly, studying her reflection in the tall mirror, searching for some sign of the woman she had been only 2 days earlier. The woman who had spent months choosing lace patterns and seating arrangements for a wedding that never truly happened. Breakfast was served in a smaller dining room than Clara expected, warmer and less imposing than the grand hall she had glimpsed the night before. Julian was already seated when she arrived, a newspaper folded beside his plate, though his attention lifted immediately when she entered. "Good morning," he said, rising briefly as she took her seat, a small courtesy that surprised her given how informal their entire arrangement had begun. "I trust you slept." "Better than I expected," Clara admitted, though I woke uncertain whether yesterday had truly happened, or whether I had simply dreamed the strangest day of my life. "I assure you it happened," Julian said, a dry note of humor in his voice that softened the tension Clara had carried into the room. "The staff are still recovering from the shock of it, and I imagine the newspapers will manage a similar reaction by this afternoon." Clara's stomach tightened at the mention of newspapers. "Do you think it will be reported?" "Almost certainly," Julian said. "A duke marrying a bride abandoned at her own wedding is not the kind of story the press tends to overlook. I am sorry for that. I did not consider in the moment how quickly this would become public spectacle beyond the chapel walls." "It was already a spectacle," Clara said quietly. "You simply changed the ending." Julian studied her for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his expression before he returned his attention to his plate. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the quiet broken only by the soft clink of silverware and the occasional crackle from the fireplace across the room. "I have arranged for a solicitor to visit this afternoon," Julian said eventually, "to discuss the practical matters of our arrangement. Living expenses, household responsibilities, the terms under which either of us might eventually seek an annulment or divorce, should circumstances require it. I want you to understand fully what protections exist for you within this marriage, regardless of how it came to be." Clara appreciated the directness, though the mention of annulment sent an unexpected pang through her chest, one she did not have time to examine before Julian continued. "I also think it would be wise for you to meet my mother soon," he said, and for the first time since Clara had met him, something like hesitation entered his voice. "She will have opinions about this marriage, and it is better you hear them from her directly than through rumor." "Your mother," Clara repeated carefully. "Does she know yet?" "She will by this afternoon, I imagine," Julian said. "News travels quickly in families like mine." Before Clara could ask further questions, Mrs. Colton appeared at the doorway, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone delivering news she suspected would not be entirely welcome. "Your Grace, there is a gentleman at the door asking to see Mrs. Ashford. He says his name is Nathaniel Cross." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Clara's fork clattered softly against her plate, and she felt the color drain from her face as every fragment of composure she had built overnight threatened to crumble at once. Julian's expression shifted, his easy warmth replaced by something colder, more guarded. "Send him away," he said to Mrs. Colton. "Mrs. Ashford has no obligation to speak with him." "Wait," Clara said, surprising herself as much as the others in the room. "I think I need to hear what he has to say. If I do not face him now, he will only find another way to reach me later, and I would rather do this on my own terms." Julian's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly, deferring to her wishes despite whatever reservations he clearly held. "I will not leave you alone with him, if that is acceptable. Not because I doubt your judgment, but because I do not trust his intentions." Clara agreed, grateful for the offer of support she had not expected to need so soon. They made their way to a smaller sitting room near the entrance hall, where Nathaniel waited, looking travel-worn and anxious, his usually confident posture replaced by something closer to desperation. "Clara," he said the moment she entered, stepping forward before catching himself under Julian's watchful gaze. I know I have no right to be here. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I had to see you, to explain. There is nothing to explain, Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. You left me at the altar for my closest friend. Whatever explanation you offer will not change what happened. It was a mistake, Nathaniel said, running a hand through his hair, his eyes pleading in a way that once might have softened her resolve. Isabel and I. It was not planned, not the way it looked. I panicked. I should have told you the truth weeks ago instead of letting it happen the way it did, in front of everyone. You did not simply fail to tell me the truth, Clara said, anger rising steadily now beneath her calm exterior. You let me walk down that aisle believing I was about to marry the man I loved, while you had already chosen someone else. You let 200 people watch me stand there, waiting, while you were somewhere else entirely, with her. Nathaniel flinched at the accusation, but did not deny it. I know. I have no defense for it. I only came because I heard what happened after, that you married him. He gestured toward Julian without quite meeting his eyes. I needed to see for myself if it was true. It is true, Julian said evenly, stepping slightly closer to Clara's side. And I would ask that you keep your business with my wife brief, given the circumstances of your visit. Nathaniel's eyes flickered toward Julian, something unreadable passing across his face, gone before Clara could name it. Of course, he said. Though his tone carried an edge, Clara did not fully understand. I only wanted to say that if you ever needed anything, Clara, or if this arrangement did not work out as you hoped, I would still be here. That is not your concern any longer, Clara said firmly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. You made your choice weeks ago. I have made mine now. There is nothing more for us to discuss. Nathaniel opened his mouth as though to argue further, then seemed to think better of it under Julian's steady, unwelcoming gaze. He offered a stiff nod and turned to leave, though at the door he paused and glanced back one final time. For what it is worth, I am sorry, Clara, truly. I believe that you are sorry, Clara said quietly. I do not believe it changes anything. Once the door closed behind him, Clara felt her legs weaken slightly, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining away and leaving exhaustion in its place. Julian's hand found her elbow, steadying her without comment, guiding her gently toward a nearby chair. You handled that with more grace than he deserved, Julian said once she was seated. I do not feel graceful, Clara admitted. I feel angry and tired and confused about why he thought it appropriate to come here at all, so soon after everything. Men like that rarely understand the damage they cause until it becomes inconvenient for them, Julian said, a hardness entering his voice that Clara had not heard before. I suspect his visit had less to do with concern for your well-being and more to do with curiosity about what he lost. Clara considered this, turning the observation over in her mind. You think he regrets his choice? I think men often want what they can no longer have, the moment someone else claims it, Julian said. Whether that is true regret or simple vanity, I could not say, but I would ask you to be cautious if he attempts to contact you again. Something about his manner today did not sit well with me. Clara nodded, filing the warning away even as she tried to push Nathaniel from her thoughts entirely. Thank you for staying with me. I know you did not have to. You are my wife now. Whatever the circumstances that brought us here, Julian said simply, that means something to me, even if this marriage began under unusual terms. The solicitor arrived that afternoon as planned, and Clara sat through a long, detailed conversation about finances, property, and the legal protections built into their arrangement, absorbing information that felt both reassuring and strangely clinical, given how the marriage had begun. Julian ensured she understood every provision made in her favor, generous terms that surprised her given how little he owed her beyond the promise made at the altar. By evening, exhausted from the emotional weight of the day, Clara found herself once again in the small sitting room, this time with Julian across from her, a fire crackling low in the hearth between them. The house had grown quiet around them, staff retired for the evening, leaving only the two of them and the soft sounds of the settling house. May I ask you something? Clara said, watching the firelight flicker across Julian's composed features. Of course. Earlier, you mentioned wanting me to meet your mother soon. What is it you expect her reaction to be? Julian's expression grew guarded, the same careful distance Clara had noticed whenever the topic of his family arose. My mother has strong opinions about duty and legacy. She will likely see this marriage as impulsive, perhaps even reckless, given how quickly it happened and under what circumstances. Does her opinion matter a great deal to you? It did. Once, Julian said, his voice quieter now. Less than it used to, I think. But she is still my mother, and I would rather you meet her prepared than blindsided, as you were this morning with Nathaniel." Clara studied him across the firelight, sensing there was more beneath his careful words than he was willing to share just yet. "Is there something else I should know? About your family? Or about why this marriage matters so much to satisfying their expectations?" Julian held her gaze for a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like old grief resurfacing. "There is a great deal you do not yet know about me, Clara. I imagine, in time, you will learn all of it. But some of it is not easily spoken of on the second night of a marriage neither of us expected to enter." Clara nodded, respecting the boundary he had drawn even as her curiosity deepened. "Then I will wait," she said, "for whenever you are ready to share it." Something shifted subtly in Julian's expression. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief, though he said nothing more on the subject that night. They sat together in comfortable silence a while longer, watching the fire burn low. Two strangers bound together by circumstance, each carrying secrets and sorrows the other had not yet earned the right to know. Before retiring, Clara wandered briefly through the ground floor corridors, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep. She found herself drawn to a long gallery lined with portraits, each one depicting a former Ashford, stern faces staring down from gilded frames spanning generations. She paused before a portrait near the end of the row, a young woman with fair hair and a gentle smile, painted in a style far more recent than the others surrounding it. "That is my sister, Beatrice," came Julian's voice from behind her, quiet in the empty gallery. Clara turned, surprised to find he had followed her from the sitting room. "She lives abroad now, married to a diplomat. You will likely meet her within the year, if she visits for the holidays as she usually does." "She has a kind face," Clara said, studying the portrait a moment longer. "She has a kind heart to match it," Julian said, something warm entering his voice for the first time when speaking of family. "She was the one person in this house who never made me feel as though duty and affection were opposing forces. I think you would like her." Clara smiled, grateful for the small glimpse into a gentler corner of Julian's life. "I look forward to meeting her then." They continued down the gallery together, Julian offering brief explanations for the portraits they passed. Ancestors who had served in wars, negotiated treaties, or simply managed the estate through difficult seasons. Clara found herself listening more to the tone of his voice than the details themselves, searching for clues about the man she had so suddenly married, piecing together fragments of history that might eventually form a fuller picture. Near the end of the gallery, they stopped before a stretch of bare wall, a noticeably empty space between two occupied frames. Clara glanced at it, then at Julian, sensing immediately that the absence held meaning. "There was a portrait meant to hang there," Julian said before she could ask, his voice carefully neutral. "It was removed some years ago. I would rather not discuss the reason tonight, if you do not mind." "Of course," Clara said gently, recognizing the same guarded distance from earlier. "I did not mean to pry." "You are not prying," Julian said. "You are simply curious about the man you married, which is entirely reasonable. I only ask for patience, until I am ready to share it properly." Clara nodded, and they continued walking in comfortable silence until they reached the base of the staircase leading to their separate wings of the house. Julian paused there, turning to face her fully for the first time since leaving the sitting room. "Thank you," he said, "for handling everything today with such composure. Nathaniel's visit, the solicitor, the weight of everything settling on you at once. I know it has been a great deal to carry in such little time." "I did not feel composed," Clara admitted. "I felt as though I was simply moving through the motions, hoping my legs would not give out before the day ended." "That is composure," Julian said, something almost like admiration in his voice. "Grace under pressure rarely feels graceful from the inside. It only appears that way to those watching from a distance." Clara considered this, surprised by the small comfort his words offered. "Good night, Julian," she said finally, testing his name aloud for the first time without title or formality attached to it. Something flickered across his face at the sound of his name spoken so simply, and for a brief moment Clara thought she glimpsed the man beneath the duke, guarded and careful, but not entirely closed off. "Good night, Clara," he answered, and though neither of them moved to close the distance between them, something had shifted subtly in the space that separated them, a small thread of understanding beginning to form between two people who had started as strangers and were slowly, carefully, becoming something else entirely. Clara climbed the stairs alone, glancing back once to see Julian still standing at the base, watching her go with an expression she could not quite name. She carried that image with her into sleep, wondering what other secrets waited behind the empty space on the gallery wall, and whether she would ever be trusted enough to learn the truth behind it. Weeks passed at Rothmere Estate, and Clara found the rhythm of her new life beginning to settle into something almost familiar, though never quite ordinary. Mornings brought quiet breakfasts with Julian, their conversations growing gradually easier, less guarded than the careful exchanges of those first uncertain days. Afternoons she spent exploring the estate grounds, learning the names of gardeners and stable hands, memorizing the winding paths through gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Charlotte had become something close to a friend, the two of them often talking long past the point required for simple household duties. It was Charlotte who first mentioned, carefully and with obvious hesitation, the story of Julian's broken engagement years earlier. "It is not my place to say much," Charlotte admitted one afternoon, while helping Clara arrange fresh flowers in the drawing room. "But the staff who were here then still speak of it sometimes, when they think no one is listening. Her name was Eleanor. They were engaged nearly 2 years before it ended." "What happened?" Clara asked, trying to keep her voice light despite the curiosity burning beneath the question. "No one seems entirely certain," Charlotte said. "Some say she left him for another man. Others say there was a disagreement between their families that could not be resolved. Whatever the truth, His Grace has not been the same since, or so I am told. He used to laugh more, they say, before all of it happened." Clara turned this information over carefully in her mind throughout the following days, watching Julian with new understanding whenever guardedness crept into his expression, whenever he changed the subject too quickly if conversation drifted too close to matters of the heart. She did not press him for details, remembering his request for patience, but she found herself growing more curious about the empty space on the gallery wall, and more determined to understand the man she had married. Their relationship, meanwhile, had begun shifting in small, unexpected ways. One afternoon, caught in a sudden downpour while walking the eastern gardens, Clara and Julian found themselves sheltering beneath the branches of an ancient oak tree, laughing together for the first time as rain soaked through their clothes despite their efforts to stay dry. "This was not how I imagined this afternoon proceeding," Julian said, wiping rain from his eyes, an unguarded smile transforming his usually composed features into something younger, warmer. "Nor I," Clara admitted, laughing despite the chill seeping into her bones. "Though I confess, I have not laughed like this in longer than I care to admit." Julian's smile softened at her words, something thoughtful entering his gaze. "I am glad, then, that the rain caught us. Even inconvenience has its uses, it seems." They ran together back toward the house, arriving soaked and breathless. And something about the shared laughter, the simple foolishness of being caught unprepared by weather neither of them had anticipated, settled a warmth in Clara's chest that lingered long after they had changed into dry clothes and warmed themselves by the fire. Small gestures began appearing after that afternoon, subtle enough that Clara almost missed them at first. A book she had mentioned wanting to read appeared on her nightstand, unexplained, though she recognized Julian's careful handwriting on a note tucked inside the front cover. Her favorite tea began appearing at breakfast without her ever having requested it specifically. Once, returning from a walk through the gardens, she found a small bouquet of wildflowers left on her writing desk, no note attached, though she needed none to guess who had left them there. She began noticing things about Julian in turn, small habits that revealed more than his careful words ever did. He hummed quietly to himself while reading in the evenings, unaware he was doing it. He always paused before entering a room where she was seated, as though giving her a moment's warning before his presence disturbed her solitude. He remembered details from conversations weeks old, referencing them casually, in ways that told her he had truly listened, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Their evenings together in the small sitting room became something Clara found herself looking forward to throughout each day, conversations stretching later into the night as the careful distance between them continued to narrow. They spoke of books, of childhood memories, of small dreams neither had voiced aloud to anyone before. Clara told him about her father, gone 5 years now, and the quiet ache that still surfaced unexpectedly at odd moments. Julian listened without interrupting, offering comfort not through empty reassurance but through the simple, steady presence of someone willing to sit with her grief rather than rush past it. In turn, Julian began sharing small fragments of his own history, though never touching directly on the empty space in the gallery or the name Charlotte had mentioned. He spoke instead of his father, a stern man who had died when Julian was young, leaving him to inherit responsibilities far beyond his years. He spoke of the loneliness of growing into a title before he had fully grown into himself, of the expectations pressed upon him from every direction, family, staff, tenants, all depending on decisions he had barely felt equipped to make. "I think that is why I understood, at your wedding, what it meant to stand somewhere alone, surrounded by people who expected something from you that you were not certain you could give," Julian admitted one evening, firelight flickering across his thoughtful expression. I recognized something of myself in you, standing there, though our circumstances were entirely different. Clara considered his words carefully. I do not think our circumstances were as different as you believe. We were both, in our own ways, standing at an altar built by other people's expectations. Julian's gaze met hers across the firelight, something unspoken passing between them, gentler than words could have expressed. Clara felt her pulse quicken under the weight of his attention, aware suddenly of how close they were sitting, how the space between them had continued narrowing over the past weeks, without either of them fully acknowledging it aloud. The moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway, and Mrs. Colton appeared at the door, her expression tight with concern. Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but there is a letter that has just arrived. The messenger insisted it required your immediate attention. Julian rose, accepting the sealed envelope with a slight frown, reading quickly, while Clara watched his expression shift from curiosity to something harder, more guarded. It seems Nathaniel Cross has been spreading rumors throughout town, he said finally, his voice tight with restrained anger, suggesting our marriage was arranged for financial gain on your part, that you orchestrated the entire scene at the chapel to secure a wealthier match. Clara's stomach twisted at the accusation, anger and hurt tangling together beneath her ribs. That is absurd. I had no idea who you even were before that day. I know, Julian said firmly, folding the letter with barely restrained frustration. But rumors rarely require truth to spread, only an audience willing to believe them. I am sorry, Clara. I did not expect him to stoop to something so deliberately cruel. Why would he do this? Clara asked, though even as she spoke the question, uncertainty crept into her voice. What does he gain from painting me as some kind of schemer? Julian's expression darkened further, something calculating entering his gaze as he considered the question. I do not yet know, he admitted, but I intend to find out, and soon. Whatever his reasons, I will not allow him to tarnish your reputation without consequence. The warmth of the evening had shifted entirely now, replaced by tension neither of them had anticipated when the night began. Clara felt the fragile progress of the past weeks threatened suddenly by forces beyond her control, Nathaniel's shadow stretching once again across a life she had only just begun rebuilding. I am not afraid of rumors, Clara said finally, steadying her voice despite the anger still coursing through her. I have already survived the worst humiliation he could offer me. Whatever he intends with this, I will face it. Julian studied her for a long moment, something like admiration softening the hard edges of his expression. You continue to surprise me, Clara. Most people, faced with such attacks, would crumble beneath the weight of them. I very nearly did crumble, weeks ago, at that altar, Clara said quietly. I do not intend to let it happen again. Julian reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the arm of her chair, a small gesture of solidarity that sent warmth spreading through her despite the tension of the moment. Then we will face it together, he said. Whatever Nathaniel intends, he underestimates both of us if he believes this will succeed. Clara held his gaze, grateful beyond words for the steady presence beside her, and beneath the worry gathering in her chest, she felt something else stirring too, quiet and undeniable, a warmth that had nothing to do with rumors or reputation, and everything to do with the man sitting beside her, holding her hand as though he had every intention of continuing to do so for a long while yet. The following morning, word of Nathaniel's rumors had already reached beyond the immediate circle of family and staff. Clara received a letter from her mother, gentle but concerned, asking whether there was truth to the whispers now circulating among their acquaintances. Clara sat at her writing desk composing a careful reply, determined to reassure her mother without revealing the full extent of her own uncertainty about how far the damage might spread. Julian, meanwhile, had left early that morning for town, refusing to say precisely where he intended to go, only that he had matters to address personally, rather than through letters or intermediaries. Clara spent the day restless, wandering the gardens without her usual patience for the quiet beauty surrounding her, her thoughts circling endlessly around Nathaniel's motives and what damage his rumors might already have caused. Charlotte found her sitting on a stone bench near the rose garden late in the afternoon, her expression troubled despite her efforts to appear composed. You are worrying yourself sick over this, Mrs. Ashford, Charlotte said gently, settling beside her uninvited. May I speak plainly? Please, Clara said. Whatever that man says about you, the people who matter already know the truth, Charlotte said. I have worked in this house long enough to recognize genuine affection when I see it, and whatever began as convenience between you and His Grace has become something else entirely these past weeks. Anyone with eyes can see it. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at Charlotte's directness. Is it truly so obvious? To everyone but the two of you, perhaps, Charlotte said, a knowing smile touching her lips. His Grace has not smiled this much in years, from what the older staff tell me. Whatever Nathaniel Cross intends with his rumors, I do not think he understands what he is truly up against. Clara considered Charlotte's words long after she had returned to her duties, turning them over with a mixture of hope and lingering uncertainty. She had not allowed herself to examine too closely the feelings growing steadily within her these past weeks, unwilling to name something that had begun under such strange and practical circumstances. But sitting alone in the fading afternoon light, she found she could no longer deny what Charlotte had so plainly observed. Somewhere between the rainstorm beneath the oak tree and the quiet evening spent talking by the fire, gratitude had shifted into something far more complicated, far more tender. Julian returned as evening fell, his expression unreadable as he found Clara waiting in the entrance hall, unable to disguise her relief at his safe return. "What did you learn?" she asked immediately, foregoing any pretense of patience. "Enough to concern me further," Julian admitted, guiding her toward the sitting room, where a fire had already been lit against the evening chill. "It seems Nathaniel has been speaking with several of my own family's acquaintances, suggesting not only that you engineered our marriage for gain, but hinting at some prior connection between the two of you that predates our meeting entirely. Lies, of course, but dangerous ones if left unanswered." Clara's stomach dropped at the implication. Why would he invent something so specific? What could he possibly gain from such an elaborate fabrication? Julian's expression grew grim. "I intend to find out precisely that, and soon. There is something beneath this, beyond simple bitterness over a lost engagement. I do not yet understand his full motive, but I suspect there is more at stake for him than wounded pride." Clara absorbed this news with a growing sense of unease, the fragile peace of the past weeks now shadowed by uncertainty about what Nathaniel truly intended, and how far he might be willing to go to achieve it. Yet even amid the worry, she found comfort in Julian's steady presence beside her, in the quiet determination with which he had taken up her defense as though it were entirely his own battle to fight. "Whatever he is planning," Julian said, meeting her eyes with quiet resolve, "I will not allow it to succeed. You have my word on that, Clara, whatever it is worth to you." "It is worth a great deal," Clara said softly, and meant it more than she had expected to, the warmth of his conviction settling something anxious and afraid deep within her chest, replacing it, however briefly, with something that felt remarkably close to trust. 3 days after Julian's return from town, a letter arrived that changed the shape of everything Clara believed she understood about Nathaniel's motives. It came addressed not to Clara, but to Julian directly, marked urgent, and delivered by a messenger who refused to wait for a reply, disappearing down the drive almost as quickly as he had arrived. Julian read the letter alone in his study, and Clara, sensing the tension radiating from beneath the closed door, waited in the hallway until curiosity overcame her patience. She knocked softly, and when Julian's voice invited her inside, she found him standing at the window, the letter crumpled slightly in his grip, his expression darker than she had seen since the night the first rumors reached them. "What is it?" Clara asked, closing the door behind her. "It seems I finally understand Nathaniel's true motive," Julian said, turning to face her, holding out the letter for her to read. "This is from a solicitor representing my mother's late brother's estate. Nathaniel Cross owes a substantial debt, one incurred through gambling losses accumulated over several years. The debt was owed to my uncle, and upon his death, the obligation transferred to our family's holdings." Clara took the letter, scanning the dense legal language until the meaning settled clearly in her mind. "He owes your family money." "A great deal of it," Julian confirmed. "Enough that its collection would ruin him entirely, socially and financially both. I believe now that his rumors were never truly about you, or even about wounded pride over losing you at the altar. I believe he hoped to provoke a public scandal significant enough that I would be forced to withdraw my family's pursuit of the debt, simply to avoid further embarrassment associating our name with his." The realization settled over Clara with sickening clarity. "He used me," she said quietly. "The wedding, the rumors, all of it, simply to protect himself from a debt he could not pay." "It appears so," Julian said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "I do not yet know whether abandoning you at the altar was originally planned as part of this scheme, or whether it began as genuine cowardice on his part and only later became something he attempted to exploit for his own advantage. Either way, the calculation involved sickens me." Clara sank into the chair near Julian's desk, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her chest. All the humiliation of that day, all the whispered rumors that followed, reduced to nothing more than a desperate man's financial scheme. She had spent weeks wondering what she had done to deserve such treatment, and now she understood the truth held no explanation, rooted in her own worth or failing at all. She had simply been a convenient tool in someone else's calculated desperation. "What do we do now?" she asked, looking up at Julian, searching his face for the steady resolve she had come to rely upon these past weeks. "We confront him directly," Julian said, "publicly, if necessary, though I would prefer to give him one opportunity to admit the truth privately first. Whatever consequences follow, I intend to see the truth known clearly enough that no further rumors can take root against you." Clara nodded, steadying herself with a deep breath. "I want to be there when you confront him. I have spent enough of this ordeal standing silently while others decided the shape of my own story. I will not do so again." Julian studied her for a long moment, something like pride mixing with the anger still evident in his expression. "Very well. We will face him together then, as we agreed we would." They arranged the confrontation for the following afternoon, summoning Nathaniel to Rothmere under the pretense of discussing a private matter, though Clara suspected he understood far more about the true purpose of the meeting than his outwardly casual acceptance suggested. He arrived precisely on time, his usual charm noticeably absent, replaced by a wariness that told Clara he already sensed the ground shifting beneath him. They received him in the same sitting room where the fragile peace of recent weeks had slowly been built, though today the atmosphere carried none of that warmth. Julian remained standing near the fireplace, arms crossed, while Clara sat composed in her chair, determined not to let her nerves show despite the pounding of her heart. "I understand you wish to discuss something," Nathaniel said, his attempt at casual confidence faltering slightly under the weight of Julian's steady gaze. "I received an interesting letter 3 days ago," Julian said without preamble, "regarding a debt owed to my late uncle's estate, a debt bearing your name, and a sum significant enough to threaten your entire financial standing should it come due." Nathaniel's face paled visibly, whatever remaining composure he carried crumbling rapidly beneath the direct accusation. "I do not know what you are implying." "I am implying nothing," Julian said coldly. "I am stating plainly what I have already confirmed through documentation. You owe my family a debt you cannot pay, and I believe your recent efforts to spread rumors about my wife were a calculated attempt to force our family's hand into abandoning pursuit of that debt, rather than risk further scandal." The room fell silent, tension coiling tight enough that Clara could hear her own heartbeat in the stillness. Nathaniel's eyes darted between them, calculation flickering behind his panic as he searched for some remaining avenue of denial. "That is not," he began, then stopped, seeming to recognize the futility of continued deception in the face of Julian's evident certainty. His shoulders slumped, the last of his bravado draining away entirely. "It began as desperation," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The debt, I could not manage it. I thought if I created enough scandal around Clara's remarriage, your family might hesitate to press collection, worried about further damaging your own name through association with mine. And abandoning Clara at the altar in the first place," Julian pressed. "Was that also calculated or simply cowardice that you later attempted to exploit?" Nathaniel's eyes flickered toward Clara, something like genuine shame crossing his features for the first time since his arrival. "That was not calculated," he said quietly. "That was fear, plain and simple. I panicked, weeks before the wedding, realizing I was not prepared for the life I had promised Clara. Isabel offered an escape, and I took it, without considering the cruelty of how I chose to leave. The rumors came later, once I understood the extent of my debt, and grew desperate for any solution." Clara listened to his confession with a strange, hollow feeling settling in her chest, neither satisfaction nor sympathy, simply a quiet recognition that the truth, however ugly, at least offered clarity where confusion had lingered for weeks. "You destroyed my wedding day, and then attempted to destroy my reputation, simply to protect yourself from consequences you created through your own choices," she said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "I know," Nathaniel said, unable to meet her eyes any longer. "I have no defense for any of it. I am sorry, Clara, more than words can properly express." "Your apology means little to me now," Clara said. "I have already rebuilt something meaningful from the wreckage you left behind. What concerns me now is ensuring the truth is known clearly enough that your lies cannot continue circulating unchecked." Julian stepped forward, his expression hard and unyielding. "You will issue a public retraction of every rumor you have spread, in writing, to be shared with the same circles you originally targeted. In exchange, I will discuss reasonable terms for repayment of your debt, rather than pursuing immediate and total collection, which I assure you would ruin you entirely and swiftly." Nathaniel nodded quickly, relief and shame mixing visibly across his features. "I will do whatever is necessary to correct this." "See that you do," Julian said, "and do not return to Rothmere again, under any pretense." Whatever business remains between us can be conducted entirely through solicitors from this point forward." Nathaniel left shortly after, his departure carrying none of the confidence with which he had arrived, and once the door closed behind him, Clara felt the tension finally begin to drain from her shoulders, replaced by something like exhausted relief. "Thank you," she said quietly, turning to Julian, "for believing me from the very beginning and for seeing this through so thoroughly." "You never gave me reason to doubt you," Julian said, his expression softening now that the confrontation had passed. "I only wish I had uncovered the truth sooner and spared you additional weeks of worry over rumors that never held any real substance behind them." Clara studied him for a long moment, something shifting clearly into focus within her own heart. Feelings she had been reluctant to name fully, finally settling into unmistakable clarity. "Julian," she said softly, "I think I need to tell you something, and I find myself nervous in a way I did not expect to feel." Julian's attention sharpened immediately, something hopeful and cautious entering his expression. "Please," he said, "whatever it is, you may speak it freely." Before Clara could find the words, however, a sharp knock interrupted the moment, and Mrs. Colton appeared at the door, her expression uncharacteristically urgent. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but there has been word from your mother's estate. Your aunt has taken seriously ill, and your mother requests you come at once. She fears there is little time remaining." Julian's expression transformed instantly, worry replacing the warmth that had been building only moments before. "I must go immediately," he said, already moving toward the door before turning back to Clara, regret evident in his eyes. "Clara, I am sorry. Whatever you meant to tell me, I want to hear it, truly. But I cannot delay this." "I understand," Clara said, though disappointment tightened in her chest at the interruption of a moment she had waited weeks to find the courage to reach. "Go. Family matters more than anything else right now." Julian hesitated a moment longer, as though weighing whether to say something further, before simply nodding and hurrying from the room, leaving Clara alone with words unspoken and a fear settling quietly beneath her relief. A fear that circumstance might once again steal away a chance for happiness, just as it seemed within reach. Clara stood in the sitting room for a long while after his departure, listening to the distant sounds of the household springing into motion, horses being readied, bags hastily packed, Mrs. Colton issuing quiet instructions to the staff. She wanted desperately to offer some form of comfort, but Julian had already gone, disappearing up the staircase to gather what he needed for the journey ahead. She found him briefly in the entrance hall, dressed for travel, a small case in hand, his expression tight with worry he was clearly trying to master, before facing whatever awaited him at his mother's estate. "How long will you be away?" Clara asked, following him toward the door. "I do not know," Julian admitted. "It depends entirely on my aunt's condition, and how my mother manages in the meantime. She has never handled crisis well on her own." He paused, studying Clara's face as though committing it to memory before the separation. "I am sorry to leave things unfinished between us." "They are not unfinished," Clara said gently, though her heart ached at the timing of it all. "They are simply paused. Go to your family, Julian. I will be here when you return." Something in his expression softened at her words, gratitude and affection mingling openly for perhaps the first time since they had met. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for understanding, for everything, truly." He left within the hour, the sound of carriage wheels fading down the long gravel drive until silence settled once more over Rothmere Estate, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and the unfinished confession still sitting heavy in her chest. The days that followed passed slowly, each one stretching longer than the last without Julian's steady presence to anchor them. Clara occupied herself as best she could, walking the gardens each morning, reading in the library each afternoon, exchanging brief letters with her mother that carried careful reassurances about her well-being despite the worry gnawing quietly beneath the surface. Charlotte remained a steady comfort throughout, sensing Clara's restlessness without requiring explanation, offering quiet company whenever the silence of the great house grew too heavy to bear alone. On the fourth day, a letter finally arrived from Julian, brief but reassuring. His aunt's condition had stabilized, though she remained gravely ill, and his mother, predictably, had grown increasingly difficult to manage under the strain of the crisis. He wrote that he did not know precisely when he could return, but that Clara remained constantly in his thoughts despite the distance separating them. Clara read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and tucking it into the drawer of her writing desk, alongside the note Julian had left in the book weeks earlier, small tokens of a connection she had never anticipated forming when she agreed to this strange and sudden marriage. It was Charlotte who eventually suggested, gently, that perhaps Clara's place was not waiting idly at Rothmere, but traveling to Julian's mother's estate herself. to offer whatever support she could during the crisis. He married you in a moment when you needed someone to stand beside you, Charlotte pointed out one evening, helping Clara prepare for bed. Perhaps now it is your turn to do the same for him. The suggestion took root quickly in Clara's mind, growing from a passing thought into a firm resolve within the space of a single sleepless night. By morning she had made her decision, informing Mrs. Colton of her intention to travel to Ashworth Manor, Julian's family estate, despite having received no formal invitation to do so. "Are you certain, Mrs. Ashford?" Mrs. Colton asked, concern evident in her careful question. His Grace's mother can be difficult in matters concerning family crisis. She may not welcome an unexpected arrival, particularly given the circumstances of your marriage. "I am certain," Clara said, steadying her resolve despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "Julian stood beside me when I needed him most, without hesitation, without waiting for an invitation. I intend to do the same for him now, whatever reception awaits me there." The journey to Ashworth Manor took the better part of a day, winding through countryside Clara had never before traveled, her nerves building steadily with each passing mile. She rehearsed what she might say upon arrival, imagining every possible reception from Julian's mother, none of which offered particular comfort as the carriage finally turned up the long drive toward an estate even grander and more imposing than Rothmere itself. Whatever awaited her within those walls, Clara understood clearly now that she was no longer the frightened bride who had stood frozen at an altar months earlier, uncertain of her own worth or place in the world. She had weathered humiliation, rebuilt her life from its ashes, and found within that reconstruction something unexpected and precious, a partnership built first from necessity, and now, unmistakably, from something far deeper. She would not let distance or unwelcoming relatives stand between herself and the man she had come, quietly and completely, to love. Drayt. Ashworth Manor rose before Clara like something out of an old painting, its stone facade weathered by generations, gardens more formal and austere than the gentle grounds of Rothmere. The carriage came to a stop before wide steps where a butler emerged, his expression carefully composed despite obvious surprise at an unannounced arrival. "Mrs. Ashford," Clara said simply when he asked her name. "I have come to see my husband, the Duke of Rothmere. I understand he is here attending to a family matter." The butler hesitated only a moment before ushering her inside, leading her through corridors even grander than those she had grown accustomed to at Rothmere, portraits of stern ancestors watching her passage with painted eyes. She was shown into a drawing room to wait while word was sent of her arrival, and it was there, moments later, that Julian's mother appeared instead of Julian himself. The Duchess was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp, assessing eyes, her posture rigid with the kind of composure that came from decades of practiced authority. She studied Clara for a long moment before speaking, her expression giving away nothing of her true thoughts. "So, you are the young woman my son married in such haste," she said finally, her voice cool but not unkind. "I confess, I did not expect you to arrive here, given the circumstances currently occupying this household." "I understand this is an intrusion, Your Grace," Clara said, steadying her voice despite the weight of the Duchess's scrutiny. "But Julian stood beside me when I needed someone most, without hesitation. I could not remain comfortably at Rothmere while he faced this crisis alone." Something shifted subtly in the Duchess's expression, surprise perhaps, or grudging reconsideration. "That is a bold sentiment, for a marriage that began under such unusual terms." "It was unusual," Clara agreed, "but it has become something more than that, whatever anyone else believes about how it started." The Duchess studied her a moment longer, then gestured toward a nearby chair. "Sit. My sister remains gravely ill, and Julian has scarcely left her bedside these past 4 days. He has not slept properly, nor eaten enough to sustain himself. Perhaps your presence will succeed where my own urging has failed." Clara felt a flicker of relief at the Duchess's grudging acceptance, though she remained cautious, aware that the conversation held layers of tension not yet fully addressed. "May I ask you something honestly, Your Grace?" The Duchess raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering behind her composed exterior. "You may ask. Do you believe I married your son for advantage? I have heard the rumors, and I understand your position requires caution regarding those who seek to marry into this family. But I want you to know plainly that I never sought this marriage, nor anticipated the affection that has grown from it." The Duchess considered this for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "I believed initially that this marriage was reckless on my son's part, a rash decision made in a moment of misplaced chivalry. I have watched him carefully these past weeks, through letters and reports from the household staff, searching for signs of regret or discomfort in his choice." She paused, something almost gentle entering her tone. "I have found none, If anything, I have found a version of my son I had not seen since before his first engagement fell apart. Whatever this marriage began as, I no longer believe it was a mistake. Clara felt tears threaten unexpectedly at the Duchess's words, relief and gratitude tangling together beneath her composed exterior. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more to me than you likely realize." "Do not thank me yet," the Duchess said, though warmth had crept fully into her voice now. "I remain a difficult woman to please, as my son will surely have told you. But I recognize sincerity when I see it, and I see it clearly in you." She rose, gesturing for Clara to follow. "Come, I will take you to him." They found Julian in a quiet bedroom on the upper floor, seated beside a bed where an elderly woman lay resting, her breathing shallow but steady. Julian looked up as the door opened, exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath his eyes, disbelief following swiftly as he recognized Clara standing in the doorway. "Clara," he said, rising quickly, crossing the room before she could speak. "What are you doing here?" "I came to be with you," Clara said simply. "I could not stay away, knowing you were carrying this burden alone." Julian's composure, so carefully maintained throughout their entire acquaintance, finally cracked, something raw and grateful breaking through the exhaustion etched across his features. He reached for her hands, holding them tightly, as though grounding himself in her presence after days of uncertainty and worry. "I did not expect this," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I did not think anyone would come. Least of all you, given how our conversation was interrupted before I could hear what you meant to tell me." Clara glanced briefly at the Duchess, who had quietly withdrawn to allow them privacy, before turning her full attention back to Julian. "I meant to tell you that I love you," she said softly, the words finally finding their way free after weeks of careful restraint. "Not out of gratitude for what you did at the chapel, though I remain grateful for that always, but because of who you have shown yourself to be in every moment since, patient, steady, and kind, in ways I did not expect to find again after everything Nathaniel took from me." Julian's breath caught audibly, his grip on her hands tightening as emotion visibly overwhelmed his usual composure. "Clara," he said, his voice barely steady, "I fell in love with you the moment you chose to trust a stranger at that altar, rather than let humiliation define you. Every day since has only deepened what began that afternoon. I love you, completely, and I have been searching for the right moment to say so since long before this crisis interrupted us." The words settled between them like something long awaited finally arriving, and Clara felt the weight of months of uncertainty, grief, and cautious hope dissolve into something warm and certain and entirely her own. Julian leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers, and for a long moment they simply stood together in quiet relief. Two people who had begun as strangers bound by circumstance and had found, against every reasonable expectation, something real and lasting between them. His aunt's condition continued improving over the following days, the crisis gradually easing as she regained strength under careful medical attention. Clara remained at Ashworth Manor throughout, offering what comfort she could, earning steadily deepening respect from the Duchess, who found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, growing genuinely fond of her son's unconventional bride. On the evening before their planned return to Rothmere, Julian found Clara in the manor's gardens, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose above the ancient trees. He joined her quietly, slipping an arm around her waist, and for a while they simply stood together, watching the light fade in comfortable silence. "I have been thinking," Julian said eventually, "about how our marriage began, and how far we have traveled since that day." "As have I," Clara admitted, leaning into his warmth. "It still astonishes me sometimes, how quickly everything changed. One moment I was standing at an altar believing my life had ended, and the next, an entirely new life had begun instead, one I never could have imagined for myself." "I would like to renew our vows," Julian said, turning to face her fully, something earnest and hopeful in his expression. "Not because our marriage requires legal renewal, but because I want the chance to promise myself to you properly, as the man I have become through knowing you, rather than the stranger who spoke those words in a moment of impulsive rescue." Clara felt tears rise, warm and unashamed this time, joy rather than grief driving them forward. "I would like that very much," she said, "though I would ask that this time, we choose the words ourselves, rather than borrowing them from tradition alone." They arranged a small private ceremony within the week, held in the gardens of Rothmere beneath the same ancient oak tree that had sheltered them during that unexpected rainstorm months earlier. Only a handful of guests attended, Clara's mother, Charlotte, Mrs. Colton, and the Duchess herself, who had insisted on making the journey despite her usual reluctance to travel. Standing beneath the oak tree, dressed simply rather than in elaborate wedding finery, Clara looked into Julian's eyes, and felt none of the uncertainty that had gripped her during their first ceremony months earlier. This time, there was no empty aisle behind her, no whispered pity from watching guests, no desperate need for rescue from humiliation. There was only Julian, steady and sure, promising himself to her not out of obligation or convenient timing, but out of genuine, hard-won love. "I promise to stand beside you," Julian said, his voice clear and unwavering. "Not because circumstance demands it, but because I choose it, every day, for the rest of my life. You taught me that courage sometimes looks like walking towards someone else's pain instead of away from it, and I intend to spend the remainder of my days proving myself worthy of the trust you placed in me that first afternoon." Clara, her own voice steady despite the emotion swelling within her chest, offered her reply in turn. "I promise to meet your steadiness with my own, to build alongside you a life neither of us could have imagined. When we first stood together as strangers, you showed me that sometimes, the worst days carry within them the seeds of the best ones, if only we are brave enough to let them grow." As the sun set gently behind them, casting long golden light across the gardens, Julian leaned forward and kissed her softly, sealing a promise renewed not through desperation or rescue, but through the quiet, steady certainty of two people who had found, against every improbable circumstance, exactly where they belonged. After the small ceremony concluded, the gathered guests moved indoors for a quiet supper, laughter filling the dining room in a way that Mrs. Colton later confided she had not heard echo through those walls in many years. Clara's mother sat beside the Duchess, the two women discovering, somewhat to their mutual surprise, a shared fondness for gardening and old novels that carried their conversation easily through several courses. Charlotte hovered nearby throughout the evening, beaming with quiet pride, as though she had personally orchestrated every gentle turn that had brought Clara and Julian to this moment. Later, once the guests had retired and the house had settled into peaceful quiet, Clara and Julian walked once more through the gallery of portraits, pausing before the empty space that had once troubled Clara with its unexplained absence. Julian stopped beside her, studying the bare wall for a long moment before speaking. "I think it is time I told you what belonged there," he said quietly. "It was a portrait of Eleanor, the woman I was once engaged to. I had it removed after our engagement ended, unable to bear looking at it each time I passed through this hall. For years, I told myself I simply had not found the right piece to replace it. In truth, I think some part of me was waiting to be certain I could look at this space again without pain before allowing anything new to fill it." Clara listened quietly, grateful he had finally chosen to share the piece of himself he had guarded so carefully since their first evening together. "What happened between you?" "She left me for a wealthier match, arranged by her family before I fully understood what had transpired," Julian admitted, some old sadness still lingering faintly in his voice. "It was not a dramatic betrayal, not like what happened to you. It was simply quiet, practical abandonment, dressed up in polite excuses about family obligation. I spent years afterward believing myself unworthy of anything deeper, convincing myself that duty and companionship were the most I should reasonably expect from marriage. And now?" Clara asked gently. Julian turned to face her fully, warmth replacing the shadow of old grief in his expression. "Now I understand the difference between a marriage built on convenience and one built on genuine choice. You have shown me that difference every day since that afternoon at the chapel, and I no longer fear what once frightened me most, trusting someone completely, and being met with equal trust in return." Clara reached up, gently touching the bare space on the wall where the old portrait had once hung. "Perhaps, in time, something new could hang here. Not to erase what came before, but simply to mark how far you have traveled since." Julian considered this, something thoughtful and hopeful crossing his features. "I would like that. Perhaps a portrait of us, commissioned properly, once enough time has passed that neither of us feels rushed into commemorating what we have built." "I would like that very much," Clara agreed, smiling as she imagined future generations of Ashfords studying their portrait someday, wondering at the story behind two people who found each other through the strangest and most unlikely circumstances imaginable. They continued walking through the quiet house, past rooms that had once felt foreign and imposing to Clara, but now carried the comfortable familiarity of home. She thought back to that terrible morning months earlier, standing frozen at the altar while whispers spread through the gathered crowd, certain her life had reached its lowest possible point. She could not have imagined then where that devastating moment would eventually lead, through humiliation and uncertainty, through cautious friendship blooming slowly into trust, and finally into a love neither of them had sought but both had come to cherish completely. Nathaniel's rumors had long since faded from conversation, the truth of his desperate scheme having spread quickly enough through the same social circles he had originally targeted with his lies. Clara heard occasionally, through distant acquaintances, that he had left the country to escape both his debts and the lingering shame of his exposed deception, building whatever remained of his future far from the community that had once welcomed him so warmly. She found she carried no lingering anger toward him, only a quiet, distant gratitude that his cowardice had, however unintentionally, cleared the path toward the life she now lived. Her mother visited Rothmere regularly in the months that followed, delighting in watching her daughter settle into a happiness that seemed, if anything, deeper and more genuine than what she had shared with Nathaniel during their brief courtship. The Duchess, too, softened considerably over time, her initial wariness giving way to genuine affection, until she began referring to Clara openly as her daughter, rather than simply her son's wife, a small shift in language that meant more to Clara than any grand gesture could have offered. As autumn settled over Rothmere's gardens, painting the ancient oak trees in brilliant shades of amber and gold, Clara stood once more beneath the branches that had sheltered her and Julian during that unexpected rainstorm, watching her husband approach across the lawn with the easy, unguarded smile that had become so familiar to her now. She thought of the frightened bride who had once stood alone at an altar, certain her story had ended in humiliation and heartbreak, and felt only gratitude for the winding, improbable path that had led her here instead, to a love built not on desperate rescue, but on the patient, steady choice of two people, determined to build something real together, one honest day at a time. Spring arrived at Rothmere nearly a year after the renewed vows beneath the oak tree, bringing with it a letter that stirred fresh excitement through the entire household. Beatrice, Julian's sister, was finally returning from abroad, bringing her husband and young daughter to visit the estate for the first time since Clara had joined the family. Julian spoke of his sister with such open fondness that Clara found herself eager to finally meet the woman whose portrait had first caught her attention in the gallery months earlier. Beatrice arrived on a bright afternoon in early spring, and Clara understood within moments why Julian held such deep affection for her. She possessed none of the guarded reserve that had once defined her brother, greeting Clara with an immediate, warm embrace, as though they had known each other for years rather than minutes. "I have heard so much about you," Beatrice said, holding Clara at arm's length to study her properly. "My brother's letters have grown considerably more cheerful since your marriage. I confess I was skeptical when I first heard how it began, but seeing you both together now, I understand completely." Clara laughed, surprised by how quickly Beatrice's warmth put her at ease. "I still find it remarkable myself some days, though I would not trade how it happened for anything, difficult as that morning was to endure. Sometimes the most difficult mornings lead to the most unexpected blessings," Beatrice said, glancing fondly toward her brother, who stood nearby, entertaining his young niece with an easy patience that surprised even Clara, who had grown accustomed to seeing gentleness beneath his composed exterior. The visit stretched pleasantly across several weeks, filled with long walks through the gardens, evenings of shared stories by the fire, and the comfortable chaos of a young child's laughter echoing through halls that had once felt formal and quiet. Clara found herself growing particularly close to Beatrice, the two women discovering shared interests in literature and gardening that carried their conversations easily through long afternoons. One evening, sitting together on the terrace while their husbands discussed estate matters inside, Beatrice turned the conversation toward more personal territory. "May I ask you something, Clara, about Eleanor, and how Julian has spoken of her since your marriage?" Clara considered the question carefully. "He told me about her, some months ago, about the portrait that once hung in the gallery, and why he removed it. I do not think he carries the same pain now that he once did, though I imagine some scars remain, regardless of how much healing has occurred since." Beatrice nodded, something thoughtful crossing her expression. "I was here when that engagement ended. I watched my brother close himself off afterward, convinced he had somehow failed to be worthy of real affection, that duty alone was the most he should expect from any future marriage. I worried, for years, that he would never allow himself the kind of happiness he deserved." She reached over, squeezing Clara's hand gently. "Whatever brought the two of you together, however unconventional the circumstances, I am endlessly grateful for it. You gave him back something I feared he had lost permanently." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, moved deeply by Beatrice's sincerity. "He gave me something equally precious," she said softly. "I do not think either of us fully understood, standing at that altar months ago, how completely our lives were about to change, or how grateful we would eventually become for the very disaster that brought us together." As the weeks of Beatrice's visit drew toward their close, Julian approached Clara one morning with an expression of quiet excitement he seemed to be struggling to contain. "I have something I would like to show you," he said, leading her toward the gallery where the empty space on the wall had waited patiently for nearly a year. A large canvas now hung in that once bare space, covered by a simple cloth. Julian pulled the covering away carefully, revealing a newly commissioned portrait, painted with careful skill, depicting Clara and Julian standing together beneath the branches of the ancient oak tree, sunlight filtering gently through the leaves above them. "I commissioned it several months ago," Julian explained, watching her reaction closely. "I wanted it finished in time for Beatrice's visit, so that when she looked upon this gallery, she would see not only the family's long history, but the beginning of something new as well." Clara studied the portrait, moved beyond words by the careful attention the artist had captured, the warmth evident even in painted expressions, the easy closeness between the two figures that reflected exactly how far they had traveled together since that terrible, transformative afternoon at the chapel. "It is beautiful," she managed finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for choosing to fill that space with something so meaningful." "I could think of nothing more fitting," Julian said, slipping his arm around her waist as they stood together admiring the portrait. "This gallery holds generations of Ashfords who came before us, each carrying their own stories of duty, loss, and occasionally, if we are fortunate, genuine happiness. I wanted our portrait to reflect honestly what we found together, not a fairy tale beginning, but something earned through patience, honesty, and the courage to trust each other, despite every reasonable hesitation." Standing beside him, studying the careful brushstrokes that had captured their likeness so faithfully, Clara felt the full weight of gratitude settle over her, not merely for the life she now lived, but for the painful, humiliating morning that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, delivered her to this exact moment. She thought of the frightened bride who had stood frozen at an altar, certain her future had crumbled entirely, and felt only tenderness now for that earlier version of herself, unaware of the unlikely happiness still waiting patiently ahead. Beatrice found them there later that afternoon, standing quietly before the new portrait, and her reaction confirmed everything Julian had hoped his gesture might accomplish. She studied the painting for a long moment, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, before turning to embrace her brother tightly. "I am so happy for you," she whispered. "Both of you. Whatever brought you together, I am simply grateful it happened." As spring deepened into early summer, Clara found herself reflecting often on the strange, winding path that had led her to this life, so different from anything she had once imagined for herself. She had arrived at Rothmere as a stranger, wounded and uncertain, wearing a wedding dress meant for another man entirely. She had built, slowly and carefully, a genuine partnership from what began as desperate practicality, discovering along the way a love more steady and enduring than anything she had known with Nathaniel, however sincerely she had once believed in that earlier affection. Julian, too, had transformed visibly over the months since their marriage, the guarded reserve that once defined him softening steadily into open warmth, his laughter growing more frequent, his willingness to trust deepening with each passing season. The empty space in the gallery, once a quiet reminder of old grief carefully guarded, now held instead a testament to healing, patience, and the unexpected gifts that sometimes arrive disguised as disaster. Standing together in the gardens one warm evening, watching the sun set behind the ancient oak tree that had witnessed so much of their story unfold, Clara reached for Julian's hand, grateful beyond measure for the strange, improbable chain of events that had brought them together. Before Beatrice and her family departed for their return journey abroad, she pulled Clara aside one final time, pressing a small wrapped parcel into her hands. "A parting gift," Beatrice explained, "though I suspect you will not need to open it for several months yet." Puzzled, Clara waited until the carriages had disappeared down the long gravel drive before unwrapping the small parcel in the privacy of her sitting room. Inside, she found a delicately embroidered blanket, soft ivory fabric stitched with small forget-me-nots along its edges, clearly meant for an infant rather than any adult use. A note accompanied the gift, written in Beatrice's careful hand, simply reading that a sister's intuition was rarely wrong, and that she looked forward to hearing happy news before the year's end. Clara sat with the blanket in her lap for a long while, turning Beatrice's words over in her mind, before a suspicion she had not yet allowed herself to fully consider began forming with sudden, undeniable clarity. She had noticed changes in recent weeks, subtle enough that she had dismissed them as simple fatigue from the busyness of Beatrice's visit. But now, examined honestly, they suggested something far more significant. She said nothing to Julian immediately, wanting certainty before offering him any hope that might prove unfounded. A visit to the local physician the following week confirmed what Beatrice's intuition had already sensed from a distance, and Clara returned to Rothmere that afternoon, carrying news that would reshape their lives yet again, though this time with a joy entirely unclouded by uncertainty or fear. She found Julian in his study, reviewing correspondence related to estate matters, and something in her expression must have alerted him immediately to the significance of her arrival. for he set aside his papers at once, rising to meet her with quiet concern. "Clara, what is it? You look as though you are carrying news of great importance." "I am," she said, unable to fully contain the smile spreading across her face despite her efforts to deliver the news calmly. "Julian, we are going to have a child." For a moment, Julian simply stared at her, as though the words required additional time to fully register. Then something broke open across his features, joy so complete and unguarded that Clara felt her own happiness deepen simply from witnessing it. He crossed the room quickly, gathering her carefully into his arms, laughing with a lightness she had rarely heard from him even in their happiest moments together. "A child," he repeated, as though testing the reality of the words aloud. "Clara, I do not have words sufficient for how this feels." "I felt much the same, reading Beatrice's note before I fully understood its meaning," Clara admitted, laughing now herself, the weight of carrying such news alone finally lifting into shared celebration. "It seems your sister possessed rather remarkable intuition." "She always has," Julian said, still holding Clara close, his hand resting gently against her stomach as though already anticipating the small life growing there. "I must write to her immediately, and to your mother as well, and to my own mother, who will undoubtedly wish to descend upon Rothmere the moment she hears." Clara laughed at the thought of the Duchess's inevitable enthusiasm, imagining months ahead filled with careful preparation, gentle fussing from those who loved them, and the slow, wondrous approach of a future neither of them could have imagined standing together beneath that ancient oak tree only a year earlier. Whatever trials had brought them to this moment, however unlikely their beginning, Clara understood now with complete certainty that everything painful and uncertain about that first devastating morning had simply been the necessary passage toward a happiness far deeper and more enduring than anything she could have designed for herself, had circumstance never intervened to guide her, however cruelly at first, toward exactly where she was always meant to be.